No, I appreciate that. That's really interesting. I think so. Kind of where I want to take us to next then is we've already kind of mentioned weak versus strong atheism and how it's not particularly helpful. There's another term that's sometimes used, which is kind of hard atheism. So often defined as certainty that there is no God. I want to kind of touch on this because again, it's used quite a lot when somebody thinks about atheists, and I want to look at it from the view of the burden of proof, essentially. So in relation to hard atheism, what should we do with the term certainty? So I feel that things like probabilities and possibilities might make more sense when it comes to trying to understand the term hard atheism. But often theists claim certainty needs to be held and then proved by the atheist philosopher. Should atheistic philosophers shoulder this burden of proof? Graham, what do you think?
Um, so traditionally, there were views about knowledge which maintained that knowledge required certainty, and uh, perhaps traditionally people might have been inclined to cast the sort of discussion about God in terms of what could be known and what couldn't be known, and that would make it look as though certainty is important to the discussion. Uh, there's also a question about, if we're going to talk about probabilities, about what certainty requires, and there is a kind of default view that many people go to that certainty requires probability 1, and that anything less than probability 1 isn't certainty. It's not clear that that actually aligns very well with kind of everyday notions of certainty. And there are kind of technical difficulties in the theory of probability about what to do with beliefs that really are probability 1. What sorts of beliefs could you give probability 1 to, and what thereafter can happen? Because if you've got a belief of probability 1, then it's kind of shielded from any evidential concerns. Evidence just can't affect it. And so the kind of traditional thought is, well, okay, so if something's going to be given probability 1, you better know it a priori. You better know it independently of experience, right? And it's not clear that even theists typically want to say that you can know that God exists independently, just completely independently of experience. Some of them want to say that, but not all of them do. So even amongst theists, I think there are going to be people who admit that actually this probability isn't 1. It's going to be kind of at least 1 minus epsilon. But that's some tiny quantity. But that's enough to count as practical certainty, or it's not the kind of certainty that requires probability 1. So that's one set of considerations here. Maybe I'll pause at this point and let Joe add something else.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about this question, I think just a little bit cl of clarity is needed on probability talk. I think that's just like systematically ambiguous, really. I mean, so many people just use probability differently. Some people use it as merely one's kind of subjective degree of confidence, so merely one's kind of personal credence. That is just basically how confident someone is on a scale of 0% to 100%, or more commonly 0 to 1. And that's a more kind of personal, subjective degree of belief, level of confidence sort of thing. And that's one notion. It's a very subjectivist kind of understanding. Another notion is like what degree of belief or what credence would be rational in light of one's evidence. So it's imposing further constraints. So like that's a notion of probability. There are still further notions of probability that are even more objective, that talk about like propensities of things or tendencies of things, or perhaps counting up ways that things could be, and then counting up the number of favorable outcomes among the total range of possible outcomes. So there are just so many different ways to precisify or disambiguate this probability talk. And once we get clear on that, then we can start to get clear on like certainty in atheism. Because I mean, someone might have just like a psychological certainty in atheism, but be totally unjustified in that psychological certainty. They might attach a credence 1 to the claim that there are no gods, but their evidence doesn't justify that sort of credence. Maybe their evidence only justifies like a zero point 0.7 credence or something like that. So yeah, I just wanted to note that for the audience, just to keep in mind these different notions of probability whenever you're talking about certainty and so on. I mean, our ordinary language talk is also really messy. I think sometimes we use probability to refer to one of these. Other times we use probability to refer to another of these disambiguations. So I guess that's what I wanted to add to what Graham said.
So now that we've said that, go back and look at, say, Bertrand Russell. Russell tended to go backwards and forwards about whether he was an agnostic or an atheist, and why he kind of went backwards and forwards on this is partly to do with not being really clear on the nature of the probabilities involved and so on. So he kind of thought, well, I can't go probability 1, right? That would be kind of irrational, right? On the other hand, but then that means if we're thinking that probability 1 is the standard for atheism, I must be an agnostic. And so he would say, I'm an agnostic in the sense that I'm also agnostic about whether Julius Caesar actually existed or not. To use Russell's own example. But if you go with and still just thinking in kind of fairly naive probabilistic terms, Russell presumably was nearly certain, like his probability was 1 minus epsilon. And surely you would think you didn't even have to be that gung-ho. Like if you were 70%, there are no gods, that's surely enough to make you an atheist, you might think. Mm-hmm. Right. And the idea that we're going to force on atheists that they have to be certain, that they have to give probability 1 or probability 1 minus epsilon, just seems really weird to me, if not to say just completely mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's another distinction here for the audience that's really important, and it's a distinction between belief and credence. So belief is oftentimes taken to be a relatively like binary state of mind or propositional attitude, an attitude that we adopt towards a given proposition, and you basically believe something when you take it to the case, you affirm it as true, you represent the world as being the way that the proposition describes. So you can either believe something, you can disbelieve something, or you can suspend judgment on the matter, you can suspend your belief. And that, I think, gives you a really nice way of carving up the atheist, theist, agnostic terrain. And then we just set aside considerations of credence, right? So credence is not binary in that way. You either believe or you disbelieve or you suspend. Credence is like a scalar. It's from 0 to 1, right? And so you might have a whole number of different credences despite the fact that you still believe it. So someone might believe that there are no gods and have a credence 1. They might believe that there are no gods and have a credence 0.8. They might have a whole bunch of different credences. And that makes it, I think, it makes it really weird to define atheism in terms of credence when we have this really clean characterization in terms of belief. And then we could just let the credence considerations kind of fall by the wayside. I mean, of course, credence considerations that will affect, you might think there's a certain threshold credence you need to meet in order to be justified in believing. So maybe it's something above 0.6. I don't know. No one knows, I don't think.
No, so that,
but like,
that last point's quite important. There just isn't a kind of neat way of matching up the credence talk with the all or nothing belief.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, another reason why it's important to, I think, carve up the conceptual terrain, or at least by my lights, it's most theoretically useful to carve up the conceptual terrain in terms of belief and just set the credence considerations by the wayside. And so atheists don't need to have credence 1. They don't need to have credence 0.9. They just need to believe. They need to represent the world as being such that there are no gods. That's the cleanest way to do it. And I think, yeah.
I guess the only sort of caveat I want to kind of just ask, this might just be me being kind of foolish, is for somebody to kind of obviously have that binary position, either yes or no against a proposition, they're going to need to have weighed the probabilities and possibilities of a presented God. So it could be let's use the God I'm familiar with, the Christian biblical God, although that has changed. The definition of that has changed over time as well. So that's a tricky one. But going with sort of classic Western concept of this sort of omni-God, obviously those different things kind of, you add those into the scales and then you kind of begin to recognize you either are affirming that, you're agnostic about that, or you're denying that. So I guess kind of those probabilities and possibilities work behind the scenes on some sort of scale or weigh system to enable your minds to potentially, actually through no choice of your own, sit within one camp or the other camp, and then from that place either kind of realize that binary decision might have actually occurred without you even really making a decision? I don't know. Does that make sense?
So one question here is about the extent to which we really do attribute even probabilistic intervals to propositions, never mind precise numerical figures. If you ask me about lots and lots of claims, I can tell you whether I believe them or not. If you ask me what's my credence, if I'm going to answer that question at all, I'm just going to have to make something up, right? Right. Yeah. So you ask me what's my credence that there are no gods, and maybe in that case I'm going to say, it's 1 minus epsilon, but that's just me. I'm kind of an unusual case. But even that wasn't a precise number. But you asked me about lots of other things. So I don't know. I mean, this is kind of a dumb example. What's the likelihood that Arsenal are going to win the league this year? I'm not going to give you a number.
I have a credence there. I think it's at least for me, it's 0.4 right now as we speak. But that might change later. I've got a 0.4 credence in that.
If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.